Welcome to the NK Storyline. This film tells the story of a mortuary guard who has been single for a long time, and one day, he is assigned to look after the corpse of a beautiful and young bride, for a very high fee, until finally feelings of excitement begin to emerge when caring for the bride's corpse. Without further ado, let's get right into the storyline. The film starts by showing a room, decorated like a bridal room. Todd is a morgue guard from the hospital. He asks a nurse about the condition of the bodies of the two bride corpses in front of his eyes. And the nurse replied, that the condition of the man's corpse was damaged. The parents of the bride and groom deliberately kept them in their own homes, because that was their wish before they were finally buried. Hearing this, Todd became more and more curious about the condition of the groom's corpse, but just a little piqued the sister immediately scolded him. Then the sister introduced the rooms in the house. And also introduced the bride and groom named Mike and Cherry. Then the nurse told him not to carelessly enter their bridal room. Sister said that actually this house was bought specifically for them to live in after their wedding, but fate said otherwise. They were involved in a terrible accident and ended up dead a few days ago. Todd then asked what accident they had, but here the nurse didn't answer Todd's question and left immediately. Sister then went into the kitchen, and asked Todd to prepare dinner for the bride and groom, or in other words an offering whose recipes and menus were prepared every night. And finally Todd was ushered into his living room, which had been prepared beforehand. Sister asks about Todd's feelings, is he afraid or is it normal? And Todd replied that he was used to taking care of patients, and guarding the morgue while he was working at the hospital. And why Todd would accept the offer to work here, the reason is very reasonable because Todd can be paid 6 times the place where he usually works. And then at dusk, the sister immediately went home. Here because the nun was gone, Todd was curious finally went straight to the bedroom of the bride and groom. Whereas previously the nurse said not to be careless if you wanted to go there. Todd completely ignored what the nurse had said, and instead slept in the bridal chamber instead of the one that had been prepared beforehand. A few moments later, Todd began to fall asleep. And a toy display belonging to the bride and groom suddenly rang quite loudly. But Todd, who had started to sleep soundly, did not wake up at all with the sound of the toy. In the evening, Todd begins to prepare a meal for the bride and groom. Todd then took the food to the room where they were stored. As Todd finished and left the room, he suddenly heard the sound of a gecko sitting on top of the bridal coffin. And because there was a gap, the gecko went into the bride's chest. Todd, who saw it, immediately looked for the gecko's whereabouts. He finally opened the lid of the coffin and was quite surprised to see a very beautiful bride with thin lips smiling. Todd also felt that the smile was a good sign for him. When he was about to pick up the gecko that was hiding behind the bride's feet, suddenly the groom's coffin moved and nudged the bride's chest.
Hey.
The groom doesn't like it when Todd touches his future wife. Todd, who seemed to know that this was a sign, he finally gave up his intention to take the gecko. A moment later Todd then returned to the bridal chamber, where he found a camera and a cassette tucked away in a drawer. Todd, who was getting more and more curious, finally started to play cassettes through the DVD in the room. But after waiting for a while, it turns out that the cassette has no contents at all. He then took the camera and opened the gallery, then saw a photo of the bride being tied. At the same time a mysterious rope appears and Todd then follows it. Turns out, the rope came from the bride-to-be whose chest was injured. But it turned out to be all just a dream. After that, the cassette that had nothing in it suddenly played a video. Where the bride during her lifetime has always been a victim of violence in their relationship. A few moments later Todd went straight to the bridal room. Todd began to notice the wounds on the neck and chest of the bride. Todd concludes, that the groom is a bad man. And he challenged that Todd wasn't afraid of the groom. After that Todd took the groom's casket for them to separate from one another, into a room used for worship. Then Todd tied him with a rope, to minimize all possibilities. A moment later, Todd took the bride out and carried her into the room, then slowly began to sew up the woman's wounds. Days passed, even Todd, who had been single for a long time, wished and treated the woman like his lover. Until one night, Todd wakes up and is surprised to see the groom's coffin is empty. He then returned to the bridal chamber, and he saw the Cherry who had disappeared. Then suddenly the window in the room rang and closed very loudly. And a moment later, Todd's legs were pulled by Sari. Todd was hit in the leg with a broken bridal toy. Afterwards, Todd is shown a reenactment of where it happened before their deaths. And finally revealed a fact where it turned out that Sari was the mastermind behind the death of her future husband. While he was forced to commit suicide because he had no other choice. Seeing this fact, Todd couldn't help but think about Sari, who had been wrong about him all this time. Then Todd saw Sari, whose body seemed to have come back to life. And then Cherry approached him, and kissed him too. And at exactly 3 a.m., Todd woke up and realized he was already in a crate. He was trying his best to be able to open the lid while crying. And it turns out that the existence of Sari above is what makes Todd unable to get out of the crate. And finally the film is over. That's the storyline of the film entitled 3 I Am 3D.